the rest of the story. You know Cicero, Roman statesman, orator, Stoic philosopher. Marcus Tullius Cicero lived in the 1st century before Christ. His words inspired the Renaissance, as well as the thoughts of innumerable writers in all of the centuries since. Sallust and Seneca, Tacitus and others made their marks, and yet it was the immortal Cicero who spoke most eloquently to posterity. At least part of the reason lies in the clarity, the simplicity, the musical quality of his style. He had such a way with words. He had such a way with the Latin language that the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch was irresistibly attracted to the texts of Cicero without even understanding Latin at all. He just explained that the phonetic organization alone had ravished his ear. And literary historians have said the same thing in a dozen different ways. According to Rolfe, quote, "In Cicero's hands, the Latin language became an instrument of precision, capable of expressing clearly and elegantly a wide range of thought. Of all of the ancient Greek and Latin writers of the best periods, Cicero's style is the most truly cosmopolitan," end quote. According to Dimsdale, Cicero fitted the Latin language to be a vehicle for philosophic thought and achieved a style which is the basis of modern European prose, end quote. And yet, were it not for a certain method of communication, I said if it were not for a certain method of communication, much of the wisdom and the beauty of the great Cicero would have been lost forever. The early Christians seemed to have known about it. It is believed that the Apostle Paul used it, this method of communication, to send many of his messages to the young churches. The ancient Egyptians seemed to have known about what I'm talking about. Scholars have discovered a contract dated 155 AD to teach the method of communication. By the 4th century, those skilled in it were being celebrated in story and in song. St. Augustine discussed one occasion in Carthage during which 8 such men were employed at once, carrying on this form of communication. The amount of literature and prose and poetry which would never have survived without that marvelous method of communication is practically inconceivable. Equally difficult to imagine is that with the beginning of the Dark Ages, the method virtually disappeared, because then it was considered a black art, so that nobody who knew how to do it wanted to continue, and nobody wanted to learn how. And yet, regardless of the power of superstition and the passing of the centuries, the words of Cicero have been preserved as a shining monument to the mind of man because of that black art, that one form of communication. How much of Cicero would we know today had that marvelous black magic not been invented? Not much. For the orations of Cicero were just that, orations, spoken words. It is not Cicero's writings which we recall and revere. It is the transcriptions of those who heard him speak. What I'm saying is that the black art, banned in the Dark Ages, the voice of the great Cicero echoing down through the corridors of time, was first transcribed in what we now call shorthand. Only now you know the rest of the story.